October 17th, 1943. 23,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Hauptmann Egon Mayer banked his Focke-Wulf 190 into position behind a formation of B-17 flying fortresses and smiled behind his oxygen mask. The American bombers lumbered through the sky at barely 280 miles per hour, their massive fuselages presenting targets so large that missing seemed impossible. German fighter pilots had nicknamed them the flying practice targets, slow enough that even novice pilots could achieve kills. Mayer's wingman, Oberleutnant Georg Peter Eder, called out over the radio with barely concealed amusement. The Americans had built bombers that could barely outrun a courier aircraft, stuffing them with so many guns that they could hardly maintain altitude. Every principle of aerodynamics suggested these lumbering giants would be massacred by sleek German fighters capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. But as Mayer closed to 800 yards for his attack run, he noticed something that intelligence briefings had mentioned, but that he had dismissed as American propaganda. Every visible position on the B-17 bristled with machine guns, twin 50-caliber weapons in the nose, a rotating turret on top, another beneath the belly, waist guns protruding from both sides of the fuselage, a tail position that could cover the rear approach. He counted at least 10 gun positions on the nearest bomber, perhaps more hidden from his angle of view. At 600 yards, Mayer pressed his trigger, expecting to see his cannon shells tear into the bomber's unarmored belly before those defensive guns could track his approach. What happened next would force the Luftwaffe to completely abandon every tactical doctrine they had developed for bomber interception. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. When Mayer's fighter entered their cone of fire, 4 gun positions opened up simultaneously, creating a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds that turned his cockpit into a storm of metal fragments. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Boeing engineering team that designed the B-17 inches 1935 understood that strategic bombing doctrine required aircraft capable of defending themselves without fighter escort. Their solution challenged every assumption about bomber design that had dominated military aviation since the Great War. Instead of building faster aircraft that might evade enemy fighters, Boeing created a flying fortress that could absorb punishment while delivering overwhelming defensive firepower against any attacker foolish enough to approach within effective range. The original B-17 prototype that first flew on July 28, 1935 weighed over 32,000 pounds empty, with 4 Wright Cyclone engines producing a combined 4,800 horsepower. These specifications made it the heaviest bomber in American inventory and one of the slowest, with a maximum speed of barely 291 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. German intelligence analysts reviewing these numbers concluded that American bomber doctrine was fundamentally flawed. Oberstleutnant Joseph Schmid, Chief of Luftwaffe Intelligence Operations, prepared assessments that dismissed the B-17 as a viable combat aircraft. His reports emphasized that German fighters could easily overtake such slow targets, delivering concentrated cannon fire that would destroy the lightly armed bombers before they reached their objectives. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, capable of 406 miles per hour in level flight, possessed a speed advantage of over 100 miles per hour. This differential seemed to guarantee German air superiority over any bomber formation the Americans might assemble. What Schmid's analysis failed to appreciate was the revolutionary nature of the B-17's defensive armament philosophy. Earlier bombers had carried perhaps 3 or 4 machine guns for self-defense, weapons that provided psychological comfort rather than genuine protection against determined fighter attack. The B-17E model that entered combat in 1942 represented a quantum leap in defensive capability, mounting 1150 caliber machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun that formed the backbone of B-17 defensive systems was itself a technological marvel that German engineers had failed to duplicate. Developed by John Browning in 1918, The weapon fired projectiles weighing over 3 ounces at muzzle velocities, exceeding 2,800 feet per second. Each round carried insufficient kinetic energy to penetrate armor plate that would stop rifle bullets cold, and when loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, they could destroy aircraft structures with devastating efficiency. The belt-fed design allowed sustained fire rates approaching 800 rounds per minute, far exceeding the capabilities of German hand-loaded cannon systems. While a Messerschmitt's MG-151 cannon could deliver approximately 300 rounds of 20mm shells before requiring reload, a single B-17 gun position could fire continuously for over a minute, putting thousands of rounds into the air. This firepower differential created tactical conditions that Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered and that their training had not prepared them to face. Lieutenant Robert Morgan climbed aboard his assigned B-17F, an aircraft he would name Memphis Belle, on November 7, 1942 at Bassingbourn Airfield in England. The bomber stretched 64 feet from nose to tail, its wingspan extending 103 feet across the English morning. Morgan ran his hand along the olive-drab fuselage, feeling the riveted aluminum skin that seemed impossibly thin to survive combat damage. Inside that metal shell, 10 men would fly into German airspace, trusting their lives to engineering decisions made 7 years earlier in a Boeing factory. The defensive armament specifications that Morgan studied during his familiarization briefing revealed the thinking behind Boeing's design philosophy. The nose position mounted 250 caliber guns operated by the bombardier, providing forward-firing capability during the bomb run when the aircraft flew straight and level. Above the fuselage, a Sperry ball turret rotated through 360 degrees, its twin guns controlled by a gunner crouched inside the plexiglass sphere. Below the bomber, another ball turret provided ventral defense, operated by a gunner who entered the cramped position through the aircraft's internal crawlway. Along both sides of the fuselage, waist gunners manned single 50 caliber weapons positioned to cover the beam approaches that represented the most vulnerable aspect of bomber flight. In the tail, the most critical defensive position, a single gunner operated twin 50 calibers that protected against stern attacks, the preferred German fighter tactic. The ammunition load for these defensive weapons totaled over 6,500 rounds, weighing approximately 2,000 pounds, and occupying storage space throughout the aircraft's interior. Each gun position received between 400 and 500 rounds, sufficient for approximately 30 to 40 seconds of continuous fire. The crew chief who briefed Morgan emphasized that ammunition conservation was critical. Defensive gunners needed to withhold fire until enemy fighters closed within effective range, typically 600 yards or less, to ensure hits rather than wasting ammunition on speculative long-range shots. Across the English Channel, Luftwaffe fighter groups were receiving their first detailed intelligence reports about B-17 operations over occupied Europe. Major Egon Mayer, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 2, studied reconnaissance photographs showing B-17 formations flying toward German industrial targets. The bombers flew in tight box formations with aircraft positioned to provide mutual defensive support, a tactic that seemed sensible, but that German analysts considered insignificant, given the presumed inadequacy of machine gun defense against cannon-armed fighters. Mayer's tactical briefings emphasized attacking from the stern quarter, where German fighters could close rapidly while presenting minimal target profile to defensive gunners. The Focke-Wulf 190 that Mayer flew carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, concentrated firepower that could destroy a bomber with a single well-aimed burst. His combat experience suggested that American bombers would prove as vulnerable as the British aircraft he had been engaging since 1940, aircraft that lacked the defensive armament to survive determined attack. The first major test of B-17 defensive capabilities occurred on August 17, 1942, during the 8th Air Force's initial bombing mission against rail yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. 12 B-17s flew the mission, encountering limited German fighter opposition that allowed them to complete their bomb runs and return to England without losses. The engagement provided minimal tactical data, but it established operational procedures that would govern subsequent missions. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Armstrong, commanding the 97th Bombardment Group, noted in his after-action report that defensive gunners had fired approximately 8,000 rounds during brief encounters with German fighters, achieving no confirmed kills but forcing enemy aircraft to break off their attacks. The psychological impact of concentrated machine gun fire exceeded its actual destructive effect, suggesting that the mere presence of heavy armament influenced German tactical decision-making. The defensive effectiveness of B-17 formations became apparent during subsequent missions, as German fighter groups committed increasing numbers of aircraft to bomber interception. On October 9, 1942, a force of 108 B-17 seconds attacked steel plants at Lille, France, encountering over 50 German fighters that pressed aggressive attacks throughout the mission. The bombers' defensive fire destroyed 4 confirmed enemy aircraft while damaging an additional 12, losses that exceeded German command expectations for what should have been a one-sided engagement. German pilot after-action reports from the Lille mission revealed growing concern about B-17 defensive capabilities. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Moritz described his attack on a bomber formation as encountering a wall of tracers that made accurate aiming impossible. His Messerschmitt absorbed multiple 50-caliber hits during a single pass, damaging his engine cooling system and forcing an emergency landing at his home airfield. The experience contradicted every briefing he had received about American bomber vulnerability. The Boeing engineering philosophy that had seemed questionable during peacetime development was proving devastatingly effective under combat conditions. By concentrating multiple weapons in overlapping fields of fire, the B-17 created defensive zones that German fighters could not penetrate without accepting casualties that made sustained operations impossible. The bomber that Luftwaffe intelligence had dismissed as hopelessly slow was revealing capabilities that would force fundamental changes in German fighter tactics and doctrine. The transformation of Luftwaffe tactics began with blood. January 27, 1943, Wilhelmshaven. Hauptmann Egon Mayer led 32 Focke-Wulf 190s against a formation of 63 B-17 seconds attacking U-boat construction facilities. His previous encounters with American bombers had taught him that standard stern attacks exposed German fighters to concentrated defensive fire from tail gunners, dorsal turrets, and waist positions simultaneously. The casualties his unit had suffered during previous missions demanded new tactical approaches that could neutralize the B-17's defensive advantages. Mayer developed what would become known as the head-on attack, approaching bomber formations from 12 o'clock level, where only the bombardier's nose guns could engage. His theory suggested that closing speed would be so rapid that defensive gunners would have minimal time to track targets, while German cannon fire would strike the most vulnerable portion of the bomber's structure. The cockpit area offered no armor protection, and hits in this region would kill the pilot and co-pilot, rendering the entire aircraft uncontrollable. The execution of Mayer's first head-on attack revealed both the brilliance and the fatal flaw in his tactical innovation. His Focke-Wulf closed on the lead B-17 at a combined speed exceeding 600 miles per hour, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible for both attacker and defender. Mayer's cannon shells walked across the bomber's nose section, shattering plexiglass and penetrating the bombardier's position. But in the 3 seconds required to complete his firing pass, the B-17's nose guns put over 40 rounds into the air, and 7 of them struck Mayer's fighter. 3 50-caliber bullets penetrated his engine cowling, 1 destroyed his oil cooler, and 2 more punched through his wing structure. The damage was catastrophic. His engine began hemorrhaging oil at a rate that gave him perhaps 5 minutes of power before seizure. Mayer broke off the attack and initiated an emergency descent toward the nearest German airfield, his tactical innovation proven effective, but at a cost that made sustained operations questionable. The head-on attack concept spread rapidly through Luftwaffe fighter units, despite its obvious risks. German pilots calculated that accepting damage from nose guns during the approach phase was preferable to facing the concentrated fire from multiple gun positions during traditional stern attacks. By February 1943, Every fighter group assigned to bomber interception duties had adopted variations of Mayer's tactic, approaching American formations from the nose and attempting to destroy cockpit crews with cannon fire. Lieutenant Robert Morgan experienced his first head-on attack on February 16, 1943, during a mission to St. Nazaire. His bombardier, Captain Vincent Evans, called out enemy fighters at 12 o'clock level, closing at what seemed like impossible speed. Morgan watched through his windscreen as 6 Focke-Wulfs materialized from a cloud layer 4,000 yards ahead, their nose guns already sparking with muzzle flashes. Evans opened fire with the B-17's nose guns at 2,000 yards, walking his tracers toward the lead German fighter. The engagement lasted less than 4 seconds. Cannon shells from the German formation struck Morgan's aircraft in the nose, cockpit, and port wing, creating a hurricane of metal fragments that wounded Evans and shattered multiple instruments on Morgan's control panel. But Evans' defensive fire had been equally effective. His 50 caliber rounds struck 2 of the attacking Focke-Wulfs, forcing both to break off with visible damage. The remaining German fighters flashed past Morgan's formation at closing speeds that made visual tracking impossible, then scattered to reassemble for another attack run. Morgan assessed the damage to his aircraft while maintaining formation position. Multiple cannon holes perforated his nose section. The plexiglass bombardier station was shattered, and hydraulic fluid was leaking from severed lines in the port wing. Evans was wounded but still conscious, applying field dressings to shrapnel wounds in his shoulder and arm. Despite this damage, the B-17 continued flying with stability that astonished Morgan. The structural integrity that Boeing engineers had built into the design was proving itself under combat conditions that exceeded every peacetime test specification. The defensive effectiveness of the B-17's nose armament during head-on attacks prompted Boeing to develop the G model, which entered service in September 1943. This variant replaced the Bombardier's flexible nose guns with a powered chin turret mounting twin 50 caliber weapons, operated by remote control from the Bombardier's position. The addition increased the defensive firepower available against frontal attacks by over 300%, creating a killing zone that German fighters could not penetrate without accepting unsustainable casualties. Technical Sergeant Tom Dye, a chin turret gunner assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group, experienced the new weapon system's effectiveness during a mission to Bremen on October 8, 1943. His powered turret could track targets with precision that handheld weapons could never achieve, and the synchronized twin guns delivered concentrated fire that doubled the probability of hits. When 4 Messerschmitt 109s initiated a head-on attack against his formation, Dye engaged at 1,500 yards, far beyond the range where bombardiers with flexible guns had previously opened fire. His first burst struck the lead Messerschmitt in the engine, destroying the coolant system and forcing an immediate withdrawal. His second burst caught the wingman center mass, tearing the port wing away from the fuselage and sending the German fighter into an uncontrollable spin. The remaining 2 attackers abandoned their run rather than face the concentrated defensive fire that had destroyed their formation mates in less than 10 seconds. The chin turret had transformed the B-17's most vulnerable aspect into a killing ground that negated every tactical advantage German pilots had developed. By November 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence reports were documenting defensive capabilities that seemed to defy the laws of combat effectiveness. German fighter pilots reported that attacking B-17 formations from any angle resulted in immediate engagement by multiple gun positions, delivering sustained fire that made accurate aiming impossible. The Americans had somehow transformed their slow, vulnerable bombers into flying fortresses that could survive attacks that would have destroyed any other aircraft in the Allied inventory. Oberstleutnant Hannes Trautloft, commanding Jagdgeschwader 54, compiled casualty statistics that revealed the strategic implications of B-17 defensive armament. His unit had lost 43 fighters during October, while achieving only 18 confirmed bomber kills, an exchange ratio that made sustained operations mathematically impossible. German aircraft production could not replace fighters at the rate they were being destroyed, while American bomber numbers continued increasing with each passing month. The defensive firepower that Luftwaffe intelligence had dismissed as insignificant was proving decisive in the air war over Europe. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, provided the most comprehensive test of B-17 defensive capabilities under maximum German fighter opposition. 376 bombers penetrated deep into German airspace without fighter escort, facing over 300 Luftwaffe interceptors that attacked continuously for over 2 hours. The resulting battle produced casualty figures that shocked commanders on both sides and forced fundamental reassessments of bomber defensive doctrine. The American losses totaled 60 B-17 seconds, destroyed with another 17 damaged beyond repair, representing a 16% loss rate that exceeded sustainable operational parameters. But German losses proved equally devastating. Luftwaffe fighter units reported 38 aircraft destroyed with an additional 54 damaged, casualties that consumed experienced pilots Germany could not replace. More significantly, the battle demonstrated that even under ideal conditions with overwhelming numerical superiority, German fighters could not prevent determined bomber formations from reaching and destroying their targets. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Major Georg Peter Eder, who had survived the Schweinfurt mission despite severe damage to his Focke-Wulf, described the experience in his after-action report with unusual candor. He had pressed 7 separate attacks against B-17 formations, expending all his cannon ammunition and machine gun rounds. His aircraft absorbed over 30 hits from defensive fire, including 4 that penetrated his cockpit area and wounded him in the leg and shoulder. Despite this effort, he achieved only 1 confirmed bomber kill and 1 probable. The mathematics of such exchanges made German victory impossible. The technical specifications that made B-17 defensive armament so effective became apparent through examination of captured weapons and ammunition. German engineers who analyzed recovered 50 caliber machine guns discovered design features that explained their devastating effectiveness. The Browning M2's short recoil operation allowed sustained fire rates without the barrel overheating problems that plagued German weapons. The belt-fed system eliminated reload delays that interrupted fire from hand-loaded cannon. Most importantly, the 50 caliber projectile carried sufficient energy to penetrate aircraft structures at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, far beyond the effective range of German fighter weapons against bomber-sized targets. Each B-17 50 caliber gun position represented firepower equivalent to multiple German machine gun installations, and the bomber carried 13 such positions, creating defensive coverage that no fighter could evade. The ammunition technology employed in B-17 defensive systems proved equally sophisticated. American armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined hardened steel cores with pyrophoric compounds that ignited upon impact, creating fires that could destroy German fighters even when hits occurred in non-critical areas. The incendiary effect proved particularly devastating against air-cooled radial engines like those powering the Focke-Wulf 190, where a single round could ignite fuel lines or hydraulic systems. German pilots learned to recognize the distinctive orange tracers of 50 caliber API ammunition, a visual warning that provided perhaps 2 seconds to initiate evasive maneuvers before the lethal projectiles arrived. This psychological impact exceeded the weapon's physical destructive capability, forcing German fighters to break off attacks prematurely or avoid engagement entirely when facing determined defensive fire. The ball turret systems that provided ventral and dorsal defensive coverage represented engineering achievements that German designers had attempted but never successfully implemented. The Sperry ball turret measured only 44 inches in diameter, yet contained 2 50 caliber guns, ammunition feeds, sighting mechanisms, and a gunner who operated the entire system while suspended beneath the bomber in a rotating sphere. The turret could traverse 360 degrees and elevate through a range exceeding 90 degrees, creating a hemisphere of defensive fire that covered all lower approaches to the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Michael Aruth, a ball turret gunner with the 300th Bombardment Group, described his position as both terrifying and tactically decisive. Suspended below the bomber with only a thin shell of plexiglass between himself and enemy fire, he possessed unobstructed views of German fighters attempting belly attacks. His twin guns could engage targets simultaneously at different angles, a capability that traditional flexible gun positions could not achieve. During a mission to Oschersleben on January 11, 1944, a Ruth destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 109s and damaged 2 others during a 20-minute engagement, his turret rotation allowing him to track targets that would have escaped ground-based anti-aircraft fire. The development of German rocket weapons in late 1943 represented a desperate attempt to neutralize B-17 defensive firepower through standoff attacks. The Werfer Granate 21, a mortar-like weapon mounted beneath Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters, could fire explosive rockets from ranges exceeding 1,200 yards, theoretically allowing German pilots to destroy bombers without entering defensive gun range. The weapon seemed to offer tactical salvation for Luftwaffe units being decimated by 50-caliber defensive fire. Hauptmann Rolf Herrmichen led the first operational employment of rocket-armed fighters against B-17 formations on August 29, 1943. His unit fired over 60 rockets at a bomber stream near Stuttgart, achieving what initial reports claimed were devastating results. However, post-mission analysis revealed that only 2 bombers had been destroyed by rocket hits, while German fighters launching the weapons had been forced to fly stable, predictable approaches that made them vulnerable to defensive fire. 3 rocket-armed fighters were destroyed by B-17 gunners during the engagement, creating an exchange ratio that favored the Americans. The rocket weapon program continued through early 1944, but operational results never achieved the effectiveness that German planners had predicted. The weapons proved inaccurate at ranges where they provided genuine safety from defensive fire, while closing to ranges where accuracy improved exposed German fighters to the same concentrated machine gun fire that standard cannon attacks encountered. The B-17's defensive capabilities could not be circumvented through technological innovation, only overwhelming numerical superiority that Germany no longer possessed. The spring of 1944 marked the collapse of German fighter resistance against B-17 formations. Major Wilhelm Batz, commanding Jagdgeschwader 301, studied loss reports that documented the destruction of his unit's combat effectiveness. During March, his fighter group had lost 72 pilots killed or missing, while replacement training programs could provide only 19 new pilots. The mathematics of attrition had become unsustainable. Each mission against American bombers consumed experienced aircrew at rates that exceeded Germany's ability to replace them, while B-17 numbers continued increasing with each passing week. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang long-range escort fighter in December 1943 should have provided the decisive advantage that allowed German fighters to avoid B-17 defensive fire. American planners reasoned that dedicated fighter escorts would force Luftwaffe interceptors into combat before they could reach bomber formations, eliminating the need for defensive armament altogether. But operational reality proved more complex. Even with fighter escort, B-17 formations regularly encountered German attacks that penetrated the protective screen, and during these engagements, defensive firepower remained the determining factor in bomber survival. Lieutenant Robert Morgan completed his 25th and final mission on May 19, 1943, returning Memphis Belle to England after months of combat that had tested every aspect of the B-17's design. His bomber showed the accumulated damage of sustained operations. Over 300 documented hits from cannon shells, machine gun bullets, and flak fragments perforated the fuselage, wings, and empennage. The port outer engine had been replaced twice after battle damage. Hydraulic lines had been repaired 17 times. The tail section had been reconstructed after a 20mm shell nearly severed the entire structure. Yet through all this punishment, the aircraft had continued flying, bringing Morgan and his crew home from missions that had destroyed less robust aircraft. The structural integrity that Boeing engineers had designed into the B-17 exceeded every specification in the original requirements. The bomber could absorb damage that would have been instantly fatal to German aircraft, continuing to fly on 3 engines, with severed control cables and with entire sections of wing surface shot away. This survivability, combined with overwhelming defensive firepower, created a weapons system that German fighters could not defeat despite numerical and tactical advantages. The defensive gunnery training program that the 8th Air Force established at Wormingford, England, transformed American gunners from enthusiastic amateurs into highly effective aerial combatants. The curriculum emphasized deflection shooting, a technique that required gunners to aim ahead of moving targets to compensate for the time projectiles needed to reach their impact point. Technical Sergeant William Fleming, chief gunnery instructor at Wormingford, developed training methods that improved hit probability by over 200% compared to initial combat results. Fleming's approach utilized motion picture cameras synchronized with machine gun triggers to record every burst fired during training exercises. Gunners could review their shooting technique frame by frame, identifying errors in lead calculation, trigger control, and target tracking. The immediate feedback created rapid skill development that traditional training methods could not match. By mid-1944, B-17 gunners entering combat had received over 80 hours of specialized instruction, far exceeding the training standards of any other air force. The effectiveness of this training became apparent in casualty statistics. During the first 6 months of 1944, B-17 gunners achieved confirmed kill rates of 0.37 enemy aircraft per 1,000 rounds fired, a 5-fold improvement over 1942 performance. German fighter pilots reported that defensive fire from American bomber formations had become so accurate that approach angles that had been viable in 1943 were no longer survivable. The combination of superior weapons and superior training had created defensive capabilities that exceeded German offensive capacity. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, commanding a fighter squadron defending Berlin, experienced the evolution of B-17 defensive effectiveness during a mission on March 8, 1944. His unit of 18 Messerschmitt 109s intercepted a formation of 73 B-17 seconds, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Noki led a diving attack from 28,000 feet, attempting to gain speed advantage that would minimize exposure to defensive fire. His fighters achieved closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, creating engagement windows of less than 3 seconds. Despite this tactical advantage, concentrated fire from multiple B-17 gun positions destroyed 4 of Knoke's aircraft during the initial pass. His own fighter absorbed 12 hits from 50 caliber rounds, damaging his aileron controls and puncturing his fuel tank. 2 more fighters were destroyed during the withdrawal phase, as tail gunners tracked targets with accuracy that Knoke had never previously encountered. His unit achieved 2 confirmed bomber kills during the engagement, an exchange ratio of 3 German fighters lost for every bomber destroyed. Such mathematics made German victory impossible. The psychological impact of sustained defensive fire proved as significant as the physical casualties it inflicted. German pilots described the experience of attacking B-17 formations as flying into a cloud of tracers that made survival seem impossible. The visual effect of thousands of 50 caliber rounds, creating streams of orange fire across the sky, created terror that transcended rational tactical assessment. Experienced pilots who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front reported that attacking American bomber formations produced stress levels that exceeded any previous combat experience. Major Günther Rahl, a veteran with over 200 confirmed kills against Soviet aircraft, attempted bomber interception duties in April 1944 and requested reassignment after 3 missions. His after-action reports described defensive fire so intense that accurate aiming became impossible, and survival depended entirely on luck rather than skill. The weapons that American strategists had installed for bomber protection were destroying German pilot morale as effectively as they destroyed aircraft, creating a psychological barrier that made sustained interception operations untenable. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo during Big Week, February 20, through February 25, 1944, when over 3,000 American bombers attacked German aircraft production facilities in coordinated raids designed to destroy the Luftwaffe's industrial foundation. The 6 days of sustained operations produced the highest combat intensity of the European air war, with over 1,000 German fighters attempting to prevent bombers from reaching their targets. The resulting battles demonstrated conclusively that B-17 defensive armament had achieved its design objective of allowing unescorted bombers to survive against overwhelming fighter opposition. American losses during Big Week totaled 226 bombers destroyed, approximately 6% of the attacking force. German losses exceeded 355 fighters, with an additional 270 damaged, consuming the last operational reserves of the Luftwaffe fighter force. More significantly, the bombers reached and destroyed their targets, despite maximum German resistance, proving that defensive firepower could protect strategic bombing operations even when fighter escort failed to prevent interception. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Lay, Jr., who flew as an observer during the Regensburg portion of the mission, described the defensive battle in his official report with technical precision that captured the systematic nature of B-17 gunnery. He observed coordinated defensive fire from multiple bombers engaging single German fighters, a tactic that created overlapping fields of fire that no attacker could penetrate. The gunners operated with discipline that contradicted German assumptions about American training standards, withholding fire until targets closed within effective range, then delivering concentrated bursts that maximized hit probability. The 15,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition that each B-17 carried represented approximately 60 pounds of projectiles delivered through 13 individual weapon systems. When a typical combat box formation of 18 bombers concentrated their fire on a single German fighter, they created a cone of destruction containing over 1,000 individual projectiles per second. No aircraft structure could survive passage through such fire, and no pilot skill could evade weapons that filled entire volumes of airspace with lethal metal. Technical analysis of recovered German fighters revealed the devastating effectiveness of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. A single hit could penetrate engine blocks, sever control cables, or destroy hydraulic systems. Multiple hits, which were inevitable given B-17 firing rates, created cascading failures that made aircraft uncontrollable within seconds of engagement. German engineers examining this damage concluded that existing fighter designs could not be modified to survive B-17 defensive fire, requiring entirely new aircraft with armor protection that would reduce performance below acceptable parameters. The final months of 1944 witnessed the complete collapse of German daylight fighter operations against American bomber formations. Luftwaffe units that had once fielded over 300 aircraft per mission could barely assemble 50 fighters by October. The attrition inflicted by B-17 defensive armament, combined with American fighter escorts, had destroyed German fighter effectiveness beyond recovery. Remaining pilots, many with less than 30 hours of flight training, could not survive contact with American formations that had evolved into highly coordinated defensive systems. Hauptmann Egon Mayer, the tactical innovator whose head-on attacks had briefly challenged B-17 defensive advantages, died on March 2, 1944, when defensive fire from a bomber formation struck his cockpit during an engagement near Montmedy, France. His death symbolized the futility of German tactical innovation against American industrial and technological superiority. The weapons that Boeing engineers had installed in their bombers 8 years earlier had proven impossible to defeat through tactical skill, numerical superiority, or technological countermeasures. By January 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved air superiority over Germany so complete that B-17 formations operated with minimal fighter opposition. German fighter forces had been systematically destroyed through attrition warfare in which American defensive firepower played a decisive role. The final statistics documented a transformation that vindicated every design decision Boeing had made in 1935. B-17 defensive gunners achieved over 6,000 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed during the European campaign, representing approximately 20% of total Luftwaffe fighter losses. The exchange ratio favored American forces by margins that made continued German resistance strategically impossible. For every B-17 lost to fighter attack, American gunners destroyed an average of 0.89 German aircraft, creating a grinding attrition that consumed irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. These numbers did not include the additional psychological impact of sustained defensive fire, which forced German pilots to break off attacks prematurely or avoid engagement entirely, reducing the effectiveness of remaining fighter forces beyond measurable parameters. Staff: Sergeant Benjamin Warner, a tail gunner who completed 53 combat missions, described his final engagement on April 7, 1945, with matter-of-fact precision that captured the routine nature of defensive gunnery by war's end. His formation encountered 12 Messerschmitt 109s attempting to intercept near Leipzig. Warner engaged at 800 yards, his twin 50 calibers creating a stream of tracers that forced the lead German fighter to break off its attack. His sustained fire damaged 2 additional fighters during the withdrawal phase, contributing to the formation's total of 7 confirmed kills without losing a single bomber. The mechanical reliability of Browning M2 machine guns under combat conditions exceeded every peacetime specification. Warner's tail guns had fired over 40,000 rounds during his combat tour without experiencing a single stoppage that prevented engagement. The weapons that German intelligence had dismissed as inadequate for sustained combat had proven themselves more reliable than the cannon systems German fighters employed, maintaining effectiveness through temperature extremes, vibration, and the corrosive effects of high-altitude operations. The strategic implications of B-17 defensive effectiveness extended beyond tactical engagements to influence the entire course of the air war over Europe. The ability of bomber formations to defend themselves without continuous fighter escort allowed American forces to conduct deep penetration raids that destroyed German industrial capacity. The oil refineries at Ploesti, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the aircraft plants at Regensburg, all fell to bombers whose defensive armament made interception prohibitively costly for German fighters. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, credited B-17 defensive firepower with enabling the bombing campaign that crippled German war production. His post-war analysis calculated that without effective defensive armament, bomber losses would have exceeded 30% per mission, making sustained operations impossible. The 1350 caliber machine guns that equipped each flying fortress had proven as important to strategic success as the bombs they delivered to targets. The engineering philosophy that Boeing had pursued in 1935, building heavily armed bombers that could defend themselves rather than faster aircraft that might evade interception, had been vindicated through 4 years of combat. The company's decision to sacrifice speed for defensive capability had seemed questionable when German fighters possessed 100-mile-per-hour speed advantages. But actual combat revealed that survivability depended on the ability to destroy attackers rather than outrun them, and the B-17's concentrated firepower achieved this objective with effectiveness that exceeded every peacetime prediction. The silence at Basingbourn Airfield on May 8, 1945, carried weight that no victory celebration could diminish. The flight line stood empty, its B-17 seconds already being prepared for transfer to Pacific operations or scrapping as surplus equipment. The bombers that had carried the air war to Germany showed the accumulated damage of sustained combat. Patched aluminum skin, replaced engines, reconstructed tail sections, each repair marking encounters where 1350 caliber machine guns had made the difference between survival and loss. The final statistics told a story of technological supremacy achieved through industrial capacity and engineering excellence. 12,731 B-17 seconds had been manufactured during the war, each aircraft representing over 1 million individual components assembled with precision that maintained performance throughout the production run. These bombers had delivered over 640,000 tons of ordnance to European targets while their defensive armament destroyed over 6,000 German fighters, creating the air superiority that made Allied victory possible. The defensive gunners who had manned those 1350 caliber positions developed bonds with their weapons that transcended normal military relationships. They understood that their survival had depended on the reliability, accuracy, and devastating firepower of machines designed by John Browning decades before their war began. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun would remain in American service for over 80 years after its development, a testament to engineering excellence that German designers had never matched. The legacy of B-17 defensive effectiveness influenced aircraft design for generations. The concept of heavily armed bombers capable of defending themselves without fighter escort became obsolete in the jet age, but the principle of overwhelming defensive firepower remained central to military aviation. AC-130 gunship, the B-52's tail turret, the defensive systems that protected every bomber until precision-guided weapons made gun armament unnecessary, all traced their lineage to the 1350 caliber positions that had transformed slow, vulnerable B-17 seconds into flying fortresses that German fighters could not defeat. The transformation from ridicule to respect to fear followed the same arc that American military equipment had traced throughout the war. German assumptions about technical superiority had proven hollow when confronted with American industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism. The bombers that Luftwaffe pilots had mocked as slow and vulnerable had delivered destruction to German cities while their defensive armament systematically destroyed the fighter forces sent to stop them. The flying practice targets had become instruments of German defeat, their 13 machine guns writing the final chapter of Luftwaffe resistance through sheer firepower that no tactical skill could overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.